All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Martin Johnson. I'm head of product marketing at Balbix, and I'll be your moderator today. We have really an exciting webcast for you, DORA, Practical Insights on How to Achieve Cyber Resilience. Now, as you know, DORA regulations are set to kick in just 10 months and will impact all financial institutions doing business in Europe. So to help you prepare, in this session, we're going to talk to two DORA experts who will be drawing on their real-world experiences to provide you with the best practices on how you can develop robust roadmaps and strategies to comply with DORA. Now, I have with me here today Paul Kelly and Sid Wahi. Paul is a transformational leader and data evangelist with over 20 years experience. He brings deep operational and leadership experience gained as a leader in risk management in the financial services environments. Welcome, Paul.
Hi, everyone.
And my second guest is Sid Wahi. Sid is a senior director of product management here at Balbix. He joined Balbix from PricewaterhouseCoopers, where he led the model design delivery of PricewaterhouseCoopers' cyber third-party and supply chain risks, supporting clients and putting a monetary value to their cyber risk, and is understanding the risk reduction implications of their investment. So welcome, Sid.
Hi, Martin. Nice to be here.
So before we get started, a little housekeeping. I encourage everyone here to engage throughout the webcast. We'll be sharing a poll questions throughout the session, and we encourage everyone to participate. So let's see. In addition, if you have any questions you'd like to have answered, please use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll address your questions at the end. So before we jump into the discussion, I'd like to throw up our first poll question, which is, what do you think is the primary motivation for the EU to implement DORA rules? I'll give you a few minutes to answer. We'll have our first bit of discussion, and then we can kind of discuss the poll results. I guess we can start with Paul. Chat a little bit about what DORA is and how it's kind of changing the EU financial institutions' approach to cybersecurity and IT risk.
Yeah, so it's the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which brings a number of things to address resilience really in the round. But I think taking a couple of steps back, what's the motivation behind it, and then why are we going down that route? And it's, the European Union is not the only people doing operational resilience regulations. They're just doing it in different ways. I would argue DORA is a little bit more prescriptive than some of the other jurisdictions, which are more principles based. But fundamentally, as we move more and more and more to a digital economy, and people transact more and more, and there are plenty of countries in Europe which are moving away from cash and are almost cashless societies, actually, your right to transact as an individual is just as important as your right to electricity, water, etc., and should be just as available to you. So we're bringing in legislation, or countries are bringing in legislation to drive that level of resilience within our ability to transact, and also, we don't want disruption to our markets either, to allow people to. So that's the sort of motivation to get there. Why is DORA significant? Well, DORA is significant for a number of reasons. One is there's some really specific and quite onerous tasks set upon financial institutions to really understand their IT risk. There's some quite detail in there. Do you really understand all of your assets and all of your data and all of your software and where it all lives? Do you know how it's all strung together? And they're fundamental questions if you want to be able to manage your resilience, right? I think that they're fair, but they're a challenge, and you've got a short period of time to get there. The other thing that it does is it starts to bring in the ability to supervise, from financial regulators, supervise third parties who provide data and/or ICT services to financial institutions. It's an approach that allows them to essentially directly supervise many of the large cloud providers and other providers of ICT services, because essentially financial services outsource a number of different things, or they leverage cloud, and therefore the regulators want to make sure that they can go in and ensure that that is just as resilient as well. Interestingly, for anybody who hasn't heard about, not that they were particularly a big provider to financial services, but Cloud Nordic, for example, who went under last year, completely no longer exist as a hosting provider in August last year, who were ransomware, didn't have the money to pay the ransom, weren't able to recover any of their customers' data, basically put a website up saying, we're really sorry, we don't have the money nor the will to pay the ransomware, and we don't have any of your data. We can't give you, we hope you've got a backup, more or less. So we know that that's plausible. And I think the other sort of moving the dial is we need to think about when, not if, and say, okay, we need to build capabilities that allow us to recover, to allow our customers to transact, or prevent damage to the financial system in a period of time within a short period of time or a period of time that's not going to cause significant harm. But we know these events happen, so they are now severe but plausible.
Sid, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely concur with what Paul said. And I'd say, Martin, that's a great question. I mean, the short answer from my perspective is, yes, it does raise the bar in terms of what the DORA regulations expect from organizations in terms of managing their cyber and technology risk in general. I mean, I think what organizations need to do is change their mindset from a cyber compliance mindset to a cyber assurance mindset in some way. And some of the ways in which you sort of comply with the DORA regulations is by adopting a risk-based approach to the compliance. I think if you look at the DORA text or the RTSs that have been recently published, I think a few weeks ago, some of them have been finalized. I think, as Paul's alluded to, it is very prescriptive and demanding in certain areas, and it does sort of encourage firms to sort of really pay attention to what they need to do to sort of increase that resilience. But one thing that sort of stands out for me is, there is a strong focus on financial services organizations in terms of how proactive they are in managing their cyber risk. So, I mean, that is very, very key for people to understand. But having said that, while DORA does introduce challenges, it's also an opportunity, right? So I think a lot of medium to large organizations, they can look at DORA as a sort of catalyst for accelerating any strategic change that they have, in particular how they manage digital risk. It's an opportunity to educate the board of directors and senior management, in terms of what are the financial or business impacts from a particular operational disruption event and what we can do about it.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think I just build on that. I think there's opportunities there as well, because at the heart of it is understanding your business better down to the nuts and bolts of how it's all strung together, how does it all digitally work, etc. And from my point of view, if you know all that, actually it's much easier for you to then cost your products. You can work out how much does it cost to deliver this particular service to your clients, and therefore you can work out whether it's profitable or not profitable, or are you pricing it correctly or incorrectly. I think also there's the opportunity there, if you're able to leverage sort of 21st century capabilities that allow you to keep this consistently up to date, then one of the other benefits is you shouldn't need to be spending a lot of money at the beginning of all of your change programs to identify the as-is state, because you should already know, right? And you should already be keeping it up to date. But the regulation requires you to do that. So in theory, that should make your change programs a bit cheaper, because you'll save quite a lot of money at the front end. And it also then allows you to better manage change, potentially. There are upsides to doing it.
Awesome. So with that, let's take a look at our first poll question. Let's see. So the question was, what do you think is the primary motivation for the EU to implement DORA rules? It looks somewhat evenly split between financial stability, but a little bit ahead on consumer protection. Very few people responded kind of to level the security playing field, or the business playing field. Is any surprises there? Sid?
Yeah, from my perspective, no surprises there, Martin. I would expect financial stability and protecting, minimizing consumer harm as the dominant two sort of motivations for sort of enacting the DORA regulations. So, I mean, yeah, as we know, I mean, you build financial stability by ensuring the financial infrastructure that supports these processes and products is as resilient as possible, and in a way that sort of minimizes disruption, thereby minimizing harm to consumers.
And you feel like just in general, CISOs are pretty aware of this?
I think they would like everything that. Yeah, exactly. I think there is a spectrum of awareness in that, but you would say most CISOs that are on the proactive side of security are aware of these kind of things.
Gotcha. So next poll question that we'll pull up is how prepared do you think you are to be compliant by January 2025? And that kind of goes in parallel with my next question to my panelists. What initial steps should new organizations take to meet the 5 pillars of ICT governance, risk, and compliance as per DORA? So do you want to take that one first?
Yeah, I mean, sure. So I think one thing that's clear is firms can expect increased supervisory engagement, right? Once DORA comes into effect. And there are 2 ways of looking at it, at least the way I think about it, there are 2 ways to look at it. Right? The first one is, as a firm, I could focus on those areas of the DORA regulation which I know will have regular outputs that could be challenged by the regulators. Concurrently, I should be able to identify capabilities that require investment and development. So, for example, you could think if you haven't done a gap assessment, I think you need to undertake a gap assessment, understand what your delta is from now to January, so roughly 9.5 months. So what do I need to do to get compliant to DORA, right? You need to sort of invest in the right kind of infrastructure and technology to sort of build out that capability. You also need to sort of look at your incident response playbooks and protocols, etc. Right? The other way to look at it is what I like to think of the operational resilience value chain. So I'm talking about from scoping all the way to monitoring. So in the scoping phase, you're looking for what are the critical services, enterprise-wide critical services? What are the detailed processes that need to sort of be executed to deliver on those services? What are the assets that sort of underpin? What's the infrastructure that underpins those services? What are the risks? What are the threats? What are the vulnerabilities to my assets? What are the controls that I have in place? How effective they are? You want to understand all this information and set up a risk appetite and a risk tolerance for your business. You want to be able to sort of ensure that your BCP, your DR plans are in place and maintained. And finally, you want to sort of finish the circle by continuous monitoring. So if you look at these distinct phases, you can sort of take steps in each of these phases to sort of fast track your DORA compliance. But given that we're 9 months away, the only thing I'd say is a recommendation is, to the extent possible, leverage AI, leverage automation to sort of reduce manual workloads and kickstart your journey.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is not forgetting your third parties. There's quite a lot of requirement to change your contracts with your third parties. So your third party ICT or data providers, the specific requirements to put in, make sure there's a proper service description, make sure you can monitor it, et cetera, et cetera. And for those services that support your critical functions, then you are supposed to contract with them for them to provide you with SLAs, for you to be able to monitor those SLAs, for you to make sure that there's an opportunity, that what the exit strategies if they don't work. How do you recover your data from them if it doesn't work? There's quite a lot of contractual provisions that you need to get there. From the flip side of that is, if you are a third party who is providing ICT and data services to financial institutions in Europe, whether you are in Europe or not outside of Europe, that's different because you're now a provider too. You need to get yourself ready to be on the receiving end of these requirements. So start thinking about, if you don't currently offer SLAs, but you think that your services might underpin critical services to financial institutions in Europe, then you need to start thinking about, okay, how am I going to generate those SLAs? How am I going to publish them to my clients? How am I going to be able to do that contracting? I think the other thing is that the DORA brings in, within those contractual obligations, from financial institutions to ICT providers, that absolute right for those financial institutions, if it supports their critical functions, to be able to have a right of audit, to ask you to participate in threat-led penetration testing, et cetera, et cetera. So you need to start thinking about, well, how am I going to service my clients to be able to meet those needs when they come and ask? it's quite a lot to be thinking about in terms of if you are a provider of ICT services or data to financial institutions. And then if you're big enough to be systemically critical, potentially, then you may be identified as a systemically critical or a CTTP, critical third-party provider, and there's a whole pile of other obligations that you need to start thinking about. But I know people like Microsoft, Google, they're all already all over this.
Great. So let's take a look at the last poll question, which was, how prepared do you think you are on a scale of 1 to 5 to be compliant by January 2025? And just looking at the results is interesting. It's almost a perfect bell curve, although nobody kind of answered 1, that I'm not prepared at all, which is actually a good sign. But also, fairly few people were, responded that they were very well prepared, or, with a 5. Again, is that surprising to you? What have you seen in the field? I mean, are most people somewhat moderately, aware of the problem and operating accordingly?
So I think it would be interesting to see whether, and I don't know who our audience are, whether they're all financial institutions or whether they are providers to financial institutions, because I wonder if there's a difference, what the shape of that curve would be between the two. I think financial institutions, they've known it's been coming for quite a while, so they should be much more ahead of the curve. I think some of the providers, the big providers, will have known for a while. Smaller providers, maybe not. I don't know.
So your kind of intuition kind of says that, financial institutions should be, aware if they're using smaller, ICT vendors, that they should, perhaps be, put them under a bit more scrutiny.
I'll just say, yeah, have those conversations early, and people are starting to have those conversations. The only other thing I was going to say, actually, to add to this is, a lot of this is not new. It already exists in some of the cyber legislation, or already exists in some of the other regulations that the EBA have put out previously, or Europe have put out previously, or regulators within Europe have put out previously. It's not so financial institutions that meet those regulations are well ahead, if you know what I mean. Third-party risk management's it's been around for ages, right? So it's a sort of codification and then tightening up and saying, right, we really need to get a bit better at all this. But the thing that really is new is the bringing in critical third parties to regulatory oversight. That hasn't happened before. But the Bank of England's just about to do that as well, right? So they've just launched their consultation on how do they do critical third-party providers. So.
Awesome. So that kind of blends into our next question here, and also our next poll question, which, for those of you who are working for financial institutions, to answer this question, how prepared do you think your critical suppliers are on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being the most, to be compliant by January 2025? And so so my question to the panelists, and maybe you've started to kind of answer this, is just thinking just holistically, why is this applicable to suppliers of ICT services? I mean, it's is this, do suppliers just say, oh, this is kind of an obligation to my financial customers, or is there some different reasons why we need to kind of focus on them being compliant versus financial organizations themselves?
So yeah, I can take that one, and Paul, please feel free to sort of add to it. So from my perspective, I mean, if you look at over the last decade or so, financial institutions have become increasingly reliant on critical third-party providers, and I'm talking about cloud providers, network service providers, payment providers, hardware providers, that kind of sort of those that are deemed critical under the regulations, right? And I mean. Yes, and these providers are a very important part of the overall financial ecosystem. They help our financial institution deliver their products and services, but they also introduce risk to the financial system. In particular, 2 types of risk that come to mind are systemic risk, and concentration risk. Those are the two really big risks that these providers bring to the financial system as a whole. And therefore, sort of what the regulation is sort of pivoting towards, or always sort of moving towards, is, telling financial institutions that they need to take ownership of the entire life cycle, manage the third-party risk through the entire life cycle of the third party. So when I say entire life cycle, I mean pre-contract, contract, ongoing monitoring, and then post-contract. And if you break it down like that, and you look at under each of these stages, there are a number of things that you can do, and the regulation is quite prescriptive in terms of some of the items that you need to action. So that's why I think third parties is becoming the focus on third parties is very, very important now.
Yeah, and I would echo that, and I would add, I think there's also, within the sort of reporting requirements, because you now need to, tell the EBA or your local regulator about your critical outsourcing and who you're doing it to, and whether they're allowing subcontracting of that, or you're allowing them to subcontract that, and what those subcontractors are. And if you think about it from a regulatory point of view, if you're thinking about critical national infrastructure, you want your citizens to be able to continue to transact, etc., and you're nervous about concentration risk because 50 banks have all got their services in the same Amazon Web Services zone or something like that, and you're worried that if that goes down, the sort of systemic failure across the organization, then they want to know, and I guess part of that is helping them to, as a, I guess, what am I trying to say? Not due diligence, well, sort of due diligence, but duty of care to the country to say, or to Europe, to understand what is the concentration risk across my market, to understand whether that is a systemic risk that needs to be managed in a different way, or indeed, is it okay the way it's being managed? Because at the moment, you probably don't know. So there's a requirement to report, and then through reporting, you'll be able to understand. So I think there's an information gathering exercise as well.
So overall, I mean, it seems, it's kind of a recap. It seems like, DORA is as much a timely response to this kind of proliferation of these, third parties, and kind of getting, the kind of use by financial institutions of these third parties, and getting them, their house in order, and that kind of, process integration between the two, as much as, just trying to apply these regulations to the financial institutions themselves.
Yeah, I guess there's a sort of, you get your house in order. We want to get their tier 1 suppliers' houses in order. We want to eventually drive good practice throughout the entire system, and therefore you are in a better space going forward.
Gotcha. Well, let's take a look at the poll question. I mean, again, was how prepared do you think your critical suppliers are to meet DORA? And similar to the previous question asking whether financial institutions themselves are prepared, it's, I don't want to say a bell curve, but most of the responses kind of fall on the middle ground, but very few of the respondents said that their suppliers were highly prepared. So basically, there's kind of a perception that their suppliers are less prepared than they themselves are. Does that surprise you at all?
And no, I don't think that's very surprising. But it's also it also raises a few questions, right? I mean, because this is one of the risk vectors through which business disruption or operational disruption can sort of manifest. The supplier could be taken out on its own, and then they can't. And Paul's already given an example of Cloud Nordic, although not in the financial services context, but it does lend to disruption across for an organization and across the ecosystem in general. Equally, if you don't understand the way a third party interacts with you, third party could also be a contagion risk into your organization. So there are two ways in which that risk could manifest. And I think if you do not, if organizations don't have much of a handle on, how they're managing that third party risk exposure across the life cycle, it is quite a severe plausibility that that's the root of disruption.
Yeah, and just understanding your points of failure. I mean,
exactly.
In a previous life, we discovered that having outsourced the provision of a switch and then looking for a secondary switch provider, having gone to provide the sort of failover secondary switch, found out that they'd subcontracted back to the primary. And so we only really had one switch. If you don't understand these things, then you aren't able to identify you've got these issues, and we didn't understand that until the issue happened. So it's sort of trying to get ahead of the game.
So before we move on, I just wanted to remind everybody online that if you have questions so far about anything that's been discussed, and we can, obviously respond to these in the Q&A session. If you want to go to your, chat and put in your questions, we'll respond to them. So one thing before we move on that just kind of struck me is, we talk about points of failure and everything. We've talked about, financial institutions and their vendors needing to change processes and look at, SLAs and there's, security stack. But one thing that, just kind of strikes me and that I think just needs to be asked in my mind is in terms of your security stack, the technology that you need to be able to address these DORA requirements. What is that, and where there's some potential gaps in most organizations, if any, in terms of their security, their technical stack.
So I mean, I think that there are some big challenges. If you read the legislation, it says something along the lines of financial institutions have to identify all of their ICT assets. Mm-hmm. And it defines ICT and information assets, sorry. And it defines ICT assets as any hardware or software that's connected to the network. Mm-hmm. And later on in some of the RTSs, it says you need to be able to identify exactly where all your third-party and open source libraries are located. So that's quite a challenge. And if you're trying to do it manually, that's really difficult, I would argue. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's really difficult. And once you've done it, it's probably out of date. So you're going to have to leverage tools and capabilities to be able to really understand all of that, I think. I don't, the scale, well, depending on the scale of your business, obviously, but the size and scale of most people's technology estate these days, and it includes everything on remote locations and everything else. To keep that up to date is a real challenge. Inventory and keep it up to date, and I think we need to start thinking about 21st century ways of doing that, rather than sort of the way we used to do it before. Then you've got you have to be able to map the links and interdependencies between them and understand how they're all talking to each other. That again is another challenge, right? Are you able to map? Do you really understand how everything is talking to each other? And we can do that with tools that leverage telemetry. But again, I think you need to start thinking about how do I use really good data products, or because we're generating the data, right? Within our environment, we tend to generate lots and lots of data. It's trying to be able to make sense of it. And so I think starting to think about tooling to deliver that is it's really useful. Again, architectural maps, we've got those. Are they up to date? How frequently do we keep them up to date? Do we know that they're true? We say it goes like this, but does it really go like that? So I think the sort of not just we've got lots of security tools, but I think tools to help us manage and almost get that single pane of glass view about what's going on in our environment is where we need to start going, just to deal with the scale of it. I mean, if you're a completely cloud-based environment, you're probably much better further up that chain, because the cloud providers keep a really good eye on how it's all strung together, because they want to charge you for it. So it's different horses for different courses, but I think that's where the investment is for this. Your security tools, I imagine, are working, hopefully, but it's understanding do you have complete coverage? Is there everything that you've got? You know, how many times have people tried to migrate from one data center to another and found a load of boxes that are connected to the network that they don't know what they are? It's time to find out what they are and to do it before you have to migrate. But if you do it, just think about the benefits again, right? So I know how everything's strung together, or I want to migrate to the cloud, or I want to go to a different service, I want to re-engineer my service. I know what the as is, and I can see how that's all operating and how I want to change it. And then you can verify afterwards that the change that you put in is actually doing what you wanted it to do. And I think that sort of more dynamic approach is required. And just as Bank of England recently said something along the lines that, cyber crime is probably the #1 threat to financial services institutions. It's an existential threat. We've seen that. And start to think about, okay, well, how do we really understand in detail what's going on so that we can really manage that risk in a much better way? If you think about market and credit risk, they're existential risks. We calculate them sometimes daily, sometimes hourly, sometimes weekly, whichever it is, but we don't just do it once a year. And therefore, we try to get as much data as possible of where we are in order to do that. And I think we need to start thinking about that for ICT risk. It's as dynamic, and the environment's changing as quickly, and maybe we need to start thinking about how do we have more dynamic risk management models.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Paul. I think the bedrock of DORA compliance begins with deep visibility into your environment. So, this is a requirement under the regulations, right? You need to, for every asset in your organization, you need to have an inventory profile, and you also need a risk profile. You need to understand, to Paul's question, all the way down to, for example, software bill of materials and the dependency tree out there. So you identify every component of, vulnerability in your environment. And then you need to sort of build out the risk picture of that to sort of manage that risk in a much more effective and efficient way. And to the point about an average organization, right, will have anywhere between 20 and 70 different security solutions that they've invested in, right? All of these solutions are spitting out information, insights, etc. Is to bring all of that in here into a sort of decision-making area where you can synthesize, then build out a single pane of glass to sort of present, to have an understanding. This is what my environment looks like, and that's the critical starting point for DORA compliance.
Interesting. So just one thing that kind of comes out of this, and stop me if I'm incorrect, but Paul, you kind of mentioned that if your organization is heavily dependent or primarily dependent on cloud services, that there's a lot of kind of built-in protections, but a lot of
I don't mean built-in protections. What I meant is they're able to surface the information to you much more easily, right? Because they're tracking it because they want to charge you for it.
Sorry, yeah, I misspoke there. But what kind of struck me is that most organizations, large organizations, particularly in the financial industry, are basically hybrid. That there's much less dependence on a lot of those cloud services, so that it's a lot harder to unearth those kind of on-prem assets and so on.
That's why to Sid's point, we've got loads of tools that are generating petabytes worth of data. Within that petabytes worth of data is probably sufficient information for us to be able to understand what's going on. What we need to do is be able to invest in the capabilities that can leverage that. Or if we haven't got them, then we need to start thinking about discovery tools, etc.
Cool. Sid, anything to add?
No, that's exactly. I mean, for DORA compliance, again, visibility is the starting point, right? And you need to really understand your environment, because that's where if you can't manage, you can't mitigate any of the risk unless you identify the risk, and you need to identify it with some level of confidence. And to Paul's point, you do need to use the latest technology out there to sort of ensure that you can kickstart this, you can make it most efficient.
Yeah, I mean, I would compare it with managing market and credit risk, right? The more data you have,
Exactly.
The better you understand your current position versus where you want to be, and how much risk you're taking, and how much you don't want to take, and then being able to adjust. Right? It's a really big data problem, and you require accuracy and sort of latency, low latency if you can, or sufficiently low latency that it makes sense that you can react and move. You know, we have new threats and vulnerabilities being identified. I think the rate is something like 12 days or something like that. It takes about 90 days sometimes to close them off, or longer. You know, why is that different to our opening new market positions, closing market positions, or giving out loans, people paying back loans, and understanding that where we are in the delta, right? It's a data problem, and being able to understand how those data, how those things fit together to be able to create a risk and understand how big the risk is, and use that information to say, well, how much risk am I prepared to take? I think fundamentally it's about risk management. It's not about reducing risk to zero. It's about being able to understand where you are, whether you can recover in a sufficient time frame from where you are, and what else you need to do about it.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, Paul. I mean, in particular, I think if you look at the network of any organization, right, it's dynamic. You've got assets that are being retired, the assets that are entering the network. You know, you've got new threats that are being that are emerging. You've got new vulnerabilities that are being identified that can be exploited on these assets. You've got new users joining the network. You know, you're building new applications, you're engaging new third parties, and this is all happening, you know, in real time on a continuous basis. So, you know, your response needs to be commensurate with that. You need to sort of leverage the AI and the automation capabilities that are out there in the industry today to be able to sort of respond dynamically to a dynamic threat like cyber.
Let's get a little bit more into
or
that.
even just change, right? You know, just getting change wrong.
Yeah.
Let's get a little bit more into that. I mean, Paul, you had kind of mentioned applying kind of 21st century approaches to, you know, achieving cyber resilience. AI is really at the core of that. So, I mean, you know, I guess the natural next question here is, you know, how can, you know, AI and automation really speed up meeting the DORA requirements, particularly risk assessment? I don't know, Sid, you want to take it first, or Paul?
I'll go, Sid.
Okay.
Sid, you can.
All right, no worries. So I think, Martin, there is no other way to kickstart or fast track your DORA compliance without leveraging AI and automation. Right? I mean, it's not a human scale problem. Paul's just described some of it in the last few minutes, right? I mean, the network is dynamic. It's changing constantly. You know, it's not possible to manage this risk using just manual or semi-automated approaches, right? The second thing I want to just say is compliance with DORA is not a one-time exercise. The requirement is to continuously comply with DORA, and you can't comply with it unless you can leverage these new tools of artificial intelligence. And as far as the AI is concerned, obviously, you know, a lot of people use the buzzword AI, but the AI needs to be explainable, right? You need to understand why you're using AI, where you're using AI. So I think, you know, the AI, you say, I'm using AI to meet this requirement, or to demonstrate this, or make this process easier. It's that explainability of AI that's sort of very, very important. Otherwise, it's just a black box.
Yeah, you need to understand why you're making those decisions, and what it is that is leading the AI to help you make those decisions. On what basis are those decisions being made? But I think when I talk about 21st century solutions, right, we now have computing power to be able to process petabytes worth of data, right, pretty quickly. So actually, we've got the computing power to be able to manage the bazillion variables that we've got in our environment, to be able to understand it better. And there's a lot of people talking about, and you know, where different places I've been, building digital twins, right? What is our data model? What is our essential model of our environment that's being kept up to date, leverage data from our environment that allows us to run test case scenarios in it, or to test different things. So, for example, can we show that our end-to-end DR chain works so that we can recover in a particular period of time? And if we've said that we can recover in a particular period of time to meet that obligation, if something changes, do we want it to be alerted to say, hey, our ability to meet that recovery time is now in threat? Or what is the blast radius if this goes down? What everything else is affected? And I think having those capabilities comes from being able to use that data to build that digital twin across multiple different things. And you can build your digital twin to as large or as small as you want. You know, is it a network one, or does it all the way go down to your business processes and the people involved in your business processes, and then all the way down to your assets? That it's up to you, right? But using those and building those models, leveraging data to really understand how it all works, how it all fits together. If I lose this, what are my core business processes that are going to be affected? What are my customers that are going to be affected? What do I need to do about that? To think ahead of time, so you can start putting in some of these severe but plausible scenarios and go, okay, oh crikey, what's going to happen if that happens? Right? Can we actually respond to that? Do we have a plan? Will we be able to back up in time? Recover from our backups? Are our backups viable? Are we doing something fun like using a backup tool for Active Directory that requires Active Directory to recover the data? You know, do we really understand all of the stuff that's going on? And can we really meet these requirements eventually and demonstrably meet those requirements? And then, don't get me wrong, if you can and you can prove it and you can start, you could theoretically start leveraging that as a competitive advantage, you know?
Correct. Exactly. And yeah, I mean, Paul's given a really good example, but I mean, as I mentioned in the start of the webinar, right? I mean, one of the sort of focuses of the regulation is on proactive cyber risk management, and you know, to be able to be ahead of the adversary, you know, to be able to clearly understand the digital twin or the digital network that you have, and where the weak hotspots are, where the weaknesses are, and what I can do about that. I think you do need to start using AI and automation wherever to make it as basically supercharge your team, increase the productivity of your team, you know, to make sure they take the right decisions in the optimal way to burn down that risk.
Awesome. So I guess just again, a reminder to everybody, if you have questions you want to be answered at the end of this session, you know, again, please put your questions in the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of your screen. So I mean, I guess the last survey question or a poll question, and it, you know, somewhat dovetails with what you've just talked about, but also, you know, the subsequent question is that do you believe cyber resilience needed to meet DORA standards can be achieved with current manual approaches? Yes or no? I mean, just basically, are you kind of in agreement with what we just talked about regarding particularly AI? But the final question to our panelists here is, from your experience, and this is somewhat of a tie-up of everything we've kind of talked about here. From your experience, what are some effective strategies for creating plans that meet DORA standards and improve digital resistance? Paul, maybe you want to take that first?
So I think go back to what Sid talked about earlier about understanding where you are against each of the requirements. So go through the regulations, go through the RTSs, build your requirements, and then understand where you are. But fundamentally, it starts with really understanding your environment. Really understand the environment and all of your third parties, and how does it all, you know, if I was to characterize most of the operational resilience legislation around the world, it's no different from DORA. DORA is a little bit more specific because it says you have to do these specific things. Is really what it's asking us to do is to understand in detail how do we manufacture and deliver our products and services to our clients, and then to understand in detail those critical services within our own businesses that are vital to the survival of our business, and then make sure that we can, you know, look after them and their resilience, because we can identify all the sources, the potential sources, people, data, technology, buildings, etc., that can take them out. Then we can start to build scenarios around what happens if, you know, everyone accepts that it's more if than when. Sorry, more when than if. And then what are you going to do? Make sure you have solid recovery strategies that you can prove that you can recover in sufficient time, that you're not going to cause significant harm to the financial system or to particular sets of clients. If you start from that holistic point of view, and why wouldn't you want to, right? Because as a good corporate citizen, then start going down to the detail and go, do I really understand everything in my environment? Can I put my hand on my heart and go, everything that I've got is accurate? And I think over time, more and more accuracy. I mean, I quite like the Bank of England, their approach has been to suggest that over time, your accuracy needs to improve, or your fidelity of your mapping needs to improve. DORA have gone straight in and go, you must understand it all. Okay, fine. Well, let's get there. But then how are you going to competently get there? And look out there in the marketplace, there are plenty of capabilities that can do bits of it. I don't think there's anything that can do all of it. So start thinking about how you're going to leverage the bits and bring them together so that you can build this picture of how do I run my business properly, or resiliently, I should say.
Sid?
Yeah. So from my perspective, as I've alluded to, I think DORA is an opportunity to sort of have a change or a transformation sort of program, especially specifically in the medium to large organizations in the financial environment. And obviously, when an organization undertakes a change like this, you're going to have like a program put in place, right? You're going to have a target operating model. You're going to have people, process, technology, infrastructure, all those sort of things that sort of go into sort of delivering the regulatory compliance. And, I mean, some of them you can do faster than others. So having the right resourcing model, recruiting the right people can take some time, etc. Given that where we are 9 months away from DORA compliance, or where people need to, I think I would sort of advocate a technology first strategy. I mean, look at the tech that's out there. Look at the tech that you have in your environment. Look at the tech that can help you sort of fast track your DORA compliance. Look at the stuff that has AI and automation built in. That's the first thing. The second thing is, as Paul's mentioned, get deep visibility into your environment. I think that is absolutely fundamental to sort of DORA compliance. And then once you've got that deep visibility, the DORA compliance also, the DORA requirements also use the language risk-based approach. If you read the text, you will see that. So you need to come up with a risk assessment approach. Now, that needs to be applied consistently. Typically, you'll see it's applied very nicely at the very well in the group level, but as you cascade down to different business units, etc., and particularly in larger organizations, things start falling through the cracks. So ensure that's consistently applied. And also, when you sort of build out that risk assessment process, try and map it to a industry-known framework or something like that. So, for example, one framework that comes to mind is, you want to build that risk assessment, look at the NIST 830 as an example. Those are guidelines by the NIST about how you should go about risk assessing. So that also allows you to reference back when you engage your supervisors. Hey, we've built our process. We're using the risk-based approach, but we've leveraged NIST 830 as an example. It adds more credibility, allows you to demonstrate that much more compliance to DORA.
Yeah, I would just add one other thing, which is back to thinking about it as an opportunity and go, okay, if this isn't a one-off, I need to keep going, and it needs to be repeatable. So I need to be able to keep it up to date and all the rest of it, and say, well, okay, what are the business potential from me getting this right? How much money do we spend on trying to understand the as is before we do change programs? How much money are we throwing at all sorts of efforts to understand our on-premise state when we want to migrate it to a cloud? We're investing large sums of money to try and understand how it's all strung together, so that we can re-engineer it and put it into the cloud. And maybe so actually, if we're going to look at capabilities to help us really understand things, well, why don't we think about capabilities that are going to service that need and service our change need and service, so we might as well build something that's strategically useful to the organization rather than just compliance.
Also, I think that's a great place to end the kind of discussion here and jump into the Q&A. Before we do that, just kind of looking at the last poll question, I'm not sure if respondents were being cheeky or what a little bit, but the response was that basically looking at do you believe cyber resilience needed to meet DORA standards can be achieved with current manual approaches? And 25% said yes. Which is at least surprising to me. Is that so? When you're talking to CISOs and everybody out kind of out in the wild, are you seeing a lot of people still believing that their manual approach is sufficient?
I mean, yeah, I'll go. I mean, I don't think, I mean, personally, based on my customers and the people I talk to, I think there's a strong appetite to sort of undertake automation and AI and use the AI capabilities, to sort of fast track DORA. I mean, without that, I think like to Paul's point, the 21st century tools, a 21st century problem needs to have 21st century solution as well. I mean, the way manual workarounds are okay, yeah, maybe in the short term, in the interim, but if you want to build a strategic solution, which you have to with DORA, because it's not a one-time assessment, you need to sort of look at that bigger picture. What do I need to do to sort of deliver that? And you do need to look at automation and AI for that.
So my take on this is, I guess it depends on how big your organization is, right? If you're quite a small organization with quite a small footprint, okay, maybe you can. I also think that if we just look at history a little bit, so if we said that the introduction of technology to support business processes really starts to take off probably the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, PCs, all that sort of stuff. And that's when fundamentally we built the how do you manage technology processes, CMDBs that are manually recertified, et cetera, our asset registers, go around, tick our boxes, go all of that. And then over time, the use of technology has grown exponentially. The size of the estate has grown exponentially. The number of assets involved has grown exponentially. And now we have virtual assets and all sorts of other things that can be spun up, thrown down, all the other things. I'm not sure, and I don't think whilst technology has changed inconceivably from where it started, I just sometimes feel that our approach to managing technology and thinking about technology risk hasn't really evolved at the same pace as the change in the technology itself. And so, yeah, some people are wedded to I think we can just manually recertify our CMDB every year. And that's why we end up with data centers where we're trying to migrate from, and we find hundreds of servers that we don't really know what they do. And I'm not sure if they then were the cause of a major incident that, and you're under regulatory scrutiny for why did you not know when we've told you that you needed to know. I mean, it's a risk-based approach. Mm-hmm. I'll pay for the problem when it arrives. Fine. But I just think there are better ways of doing it. But you have to think about it not as compliance. There are better ways of doing it because of the business value that you can get from doing it. Right? I don't know. My estimate, I'd say 10 to 20% of every change program costs are around discovery of the as-is. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think that is. As a commercial business, I'd love to not spend that money.
All right. So it's an awesome place to end. We do have, so just quickly, we have a few minutes left. We can maybe get to a couple of questions that just came in. One is, this is fairly simple. Does this regulation apply only to EU-based institutions, or also to the institutions in the UK who might transact with or capture data from EU-based customers?
So it applies to those institutions whose products are regulated by European regulators. Mm-hmm. And it applies to those businesses which provide those institutions with so let's go back to the financial institution. So if you have a license to sell that product, mm-hmm. a financial product in Europe, it applies to you. And it also applies to you if you are a third party who provides data or ICT services to that provider of financial services.
Now, would that also apply to like bank to bank, like a UK bank doing business with another, EU bank, that they would then have to be compliant as well?
So it depends on what you're. If you're just transacting, then no, that's not a product. Right. If you are not covered by you don't need a license from the European Union to do that activity, then no. But if you were providing critical data, and that was deemed to be a data provider, then I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to go down there. But my understanding of it is, it's about provision of financial products, and then it's about provision of data or ICT services to financial institutions in that sell their products in Europe.
Got it. Another question: how does DORA relate to other compliance initiatives that we are also trying to address?
So I'll go.
No, go for it, Bob. I'll add to
it. Okay. So look, I think there's quite significant overlap from a whole bunch of different operational resilience, operational risks, cybersecurity initiatives, and compliance around different parts of the world requiring you to do different things. There's quite a lot of overlap. So do this and it will service multiple different things. But actually, if you just take a step back and go, if I really wanted to have an efficient business that was well run, that was resilient and help my clients and my customers, if I started from that point of view and did everything to do no harm to the financial system, do no harm to my clients, I would probably build these capabilities anyway. And regulation is always around, let's close the stable door after the horse is bolted. Something's happened. And so regulators go, well, we don't want that to happen anymore, and write regulations. And so everybody has to become compliant. But if you started from the point of view of, I don't want any of that stuff to happen to me or my clients, I'm going to build resilient capabilities, I would argue most of it you would probably get there, because you would see the commercial advantage of doing so.
Yeah, and completely agree, Paul. I think it does overlap with some of the regulations that's already existing. So, for example, the EBA's guidelines on outsourcing, for example, the EIOPA's guidelines on governance and risk assessments, some of the disclosure requirements for ESMA and those kind of things. So there is some overlap. So, but the only thing is DORA is more prescriptive than anything else we've seen so far. That's the only difference.
So with that, let's wrap up here. There's a couple additional questions that I see that may require a little bit more thought. Just to kind of leave you with this, I mean, if you have additional questions, you can just email me at martin.johnson@balbix.com, and I'll make sure that those questions get answered. So that's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us and submitting your questions. If you enjoyed this webinar, please consider registering for the Bridging the Board CISO Gap webinar next week on Tuesday, March the 5th. During the webinar, our industry experts will provide insights on effective board communication and cybersecurity governance. Check the chat for the registration link, or visit the top bar of our website at balbix.com. As far as this webcast is concerned, we'll send out a full recording of the webinar soon, so keep an eye out, and we hope to see you at the next webcast. Thanks to my panelists here, and thanks to everybody else. Have a great evening.